Good morning. The big news today being announced on Telegram channels about Ukraine is that allegedly President Zelensky has indicated that he has been told by the Biden administration that Ukraine has until November of 2023, in which time to demonstrate success, and that success is being sketched out as being the retaking of Crimea. The reporting by Telegram channel Resident, which Resident does appear to provide reliable information, is suggesting that Ukrainian forces need to find a way through to the Sea of Azov by November. And if they don't, then by November of this year, 2023, the military and financial aid provided by the US and the West will begin to decline. This timeline is quite possibly tied into the US presidential election cycle in November of 2024. So 1 year, 12 months after this alleged deadline, Joe Biden will be up for re-election. At this stage, it looks as though he will be competing against either Donald Trump or Robert Kennedy Jr., the primary frontrunners at this stage. Up until yesterday, there may have been a chance of Mike Pence running. However, he committed political suicide on stage yesterday with Tucker Carlson, where when Tucker asked Mike Pence why so much money was being sent to Ukraine and yet the cities of America were being ignored, Pence's mind-blowing response was to say, "That's not my concern," and then backing it up and saying, "Tucker, that's not my concern." For an American presidential candidate to state publicly and clear up any doubt by reiterating that the welfare of United States cities is not his concern is something that is just meat to the sharks, blood to sharks in terms of the political scene in this presidential election. Mike Pence is sunk. But anyhow, getting back to the topic on hand. Yes, it appears as though November is the due date, is the deadline that the Ukrainian forces must achieve a success, and that success needs to be making their way to the Sea of Azov, cutting off Crimea and being able to then work towards retaking Crimea. This is a massive ask. The offensive, which started in June, the Ukrainian offensive, was intended to achieve that. But as we saw in the very first days of that offensive, minefields put an end to that dream or that plan for the Ukrainians, and they have suffered incredibly heavy losses. Estimates of 20,000 soldiers lost in the last 6 weeks for the Ukrainians. Hundreds of tanks lost, and many of these tanks and armoured pieces of equipment and artillery and radar systems visually confirmed with video as having been lost. Gut-wrenching videos of Ukrainian men trapped in minefields battling to get back to a Bradley fighting vehicle. Horrible. It's been a horrible offensive for the Ukrainian forces. And that attempt in this offensive to get to the Sea of Azov was refuted and stopped by the Russians before the Ukrainians had even made it to the main Russian lines of defense. The Ukrainians have been held up in what's been called the grey zone, and there has been very little land captured by the Ukrainians. And in the last week, if we were to sum it up, probably net, there's been no ground won, as the Russians have, up in the northern areas around Kupiansk and Liman, in the Kremenaya forest area, have reportedly claimed a bit of ground in the last few days, and in some areas have made advances up to 3 or 4 kilometres, which are big in terms of how this conflict has gone over the last 9 months. That's a big advance to make. So the pressure is really on for Ukraine and Zelensky now. Particularly for Zelensky, as there are continuing rumours that Ukrainian Armed Forces Commander Valery Zaluzhny is again recommending that the Ukrainians do not embark upon an offensive and attempt to get to the Sea of Azov. Zaluzhny has been reportedly making these claims and protestations to Zelensky for some time. When he's been asked what they should do, he suggested that at this stage they should regroup, they should fall back into a defensive position because they are unable to successfully complete an offensive attack and make their way to the Sea of Azov. Zaluzhny is basing this on a couple of, I think, simple military truths about the current situation. One is the artillery mismatch. The Russians have more artillery pieces and they have more artillery shells. Ukraine in the last week, it's been announced by the Biden administration that the US will provide cluster munitions, cluster shells of the 155mm variety to the Ukrainians in order to give them something to be able to fire. Because the Western armies of NATO are unable to provide Ukraine with the 155mm shells they require to be able to fire enough ordnance at Russia to win in these artillery battles that are happening on the front line at the moment. There are a number of areas on the front line where what seems to be the intent at the moment is to take out each other's artillery. And in these cases, the Russians with additional shells, in some reports firing up to 40,000 shells a day across the front line, versus the Ukrainians firing between 3,000 and 5,000, possibly some reporting 7,000 shells a day. A serious mismatch in the volume of artillery going towards the Ukrainians. This is one of the realities that Zaluzhny is aware of. The other big one is the air battle. There has been a report this week from the Russian Military of Defense that in the battle, in the offensive, there's been at least 25 Ukrainian jets have been destroyed, along with a number of Ukrainian helicopters. The number of destroyed and shot down Russian aircraft is far, far smaller. And during the last 6 weeks, I'm not aware of any Russian jets having been shot down. There may have been some, but I haven't seen that reporting. Certainly there have been some Russian helicopters brought down, but very few in comparison. So all of this pressure may be leading to what some of the, like Slavengrad Telegram channel was reporting yesterday and the day before, that Russian intelligence believes that the Ukrainians are preparing for an offensive in the Kherson region. So Kherson is to the in the southwest of Ukraine, not as far down as Odessa, but in the southwest compared to where a lot of the fighting is. Kherson's probably the most southern region where the fighting's going on at the moment. And Kherson is a city on the Dnieper River, and this area where the offensive is likely to take place is just to the southwest of the Antonovsky Bridge. This bridge has been an area hot for fighting in the last few weeks, with the Ukrainians establishing a bridgehead on the eastern side, or the left side of the Dnieper River. This Antonovsky Bridge was destroyed last year by the Russians. However, there were a few spans remaining on the eastern side, and the Ukrainians were using that as some shelter. There were some missile strikes by the Russians on there. The Ukrainians have managed to retain some foothold on the eastern side of the bridge, and the Russians appear to have pulled back to some extent. This area on the eastern side is an area that was swept by flooding after the Nova Kakhovka Dam was destroyed a few weeks back. That was something which was understood as a possibility. If you remember last year, the Russians were actually over on the western side of the Dnieper River in Kherson and held the Kherson city area. They performed a withdrawal from there. The Ukrainians mounted an offensive, and the Russians, it appears, made a tactical decision to withdraw from Kherson to get their troops back over the Dnieper River, so that if the Ukrainians were to destroy the Novokharkovka Dam, that they wouldn't find they had their forces in Kherson cut off and isolated from resupply and support. So they made the decision to withdraw and have held the position on the eastern side. So just south of this Antonovsky Bridge area, there is a series of islands where the river flowing through this area has a series of small islands. And there has been reporting in the last few days that the Ukrainians are building forces in this area and that we may see an offensive there. So, given... If we believe that the reporting of what Zelensky has reportedly said is correct, and that a deadline has been established, then we believe that the Russian intelligence is correct in its belief that an offensive will begin in the Kherson region, then we may see in the next few days something happening here. Now, the Kherson region, there has been some change in the layout of that area of fighting there due to the flooding that occurred. There were some Russian positions that the Russians lost, although they will have now, given that the floodwaters have subsided, will have perhaps retaken those areas. But this is an area perhaps closest to a point to get down to the Sea of Azov and to cut off the Crimean land bridge there. Interestingly, looking at some of the outcomes of the NATO summit, clearly Ukraine's not being admitted into NATO, and there's no path for that to occur at this stage. There has been discussions made by the US and NATO that Ukraine will be considered for entry into NATO once this conflict has ended. Now, this brings up an interesting point which some people have been commenting on, which relates to Poland. Now, Poland and Ukraine have over the last 600 years claimed areas of Western Ukraine as Polish and Ukrainian. There's a long history of dispute over some of those lands. But there has recently been a suggestion that Poland might wish to deploy peacekeeping forces into Ukraine, which on the face of it, you would think that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky would appreciate and want. However, he's rejected these offers to put Polish peacekeepers into Ukraine, and there's been a couple of topics of interesting topics and comments about this. One is that Zelensky may be concerned that if Polish forces are established within Ukraine, that they may then assume such a size and strength in relation to the Ukrainian forces, who have suffered bitterly in the last 15 months or so, 17 months. And that if the Ukrainian state were to collapse due to the pressure of this war, due to Russia's continued grinding, slow movements westward, if NATO and Western military aid was to dry up, that Ukraine may then find themselves occupied by Polish forces, and that those Polish forces may wish to retain ownership of some of the western oblasts, western areas of Ukraine. This has been suggested by some other people. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova has said that there is now an obvious desire of Poland to invade the western part of Ukraine. Now, in this case, she's the Ministry of Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson, so take what she says with the appropriate amount of skepticism. However, this does align with what some other people are suggesting may be the cause for Zelensky not wanting Polish peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, when, as I say, on the face of it, you would think that he would accept that. She goes on to say, this is why Ukraine is not invited to NATO. Because if Ukraine was a NATO state, then Poland would not be able to claim some of the Ukrainian territory. Now, this is getting down in the rabbit hole, I'll grant you that, but in times of war, there is always the fog of war. Many things are not as they appear on the surface. Many backroom deals are done. Strategies will engage in deception. So is it possible that Poland might be looking at a weakened Ukraine and wondering how would they best position themselves? What would be the best scenario in terms of NATO citizenship for Ukraine? And are they wondering, perhaps, if we put forces in there and if things go badly for Ukraine in terms of its state and sovereignty, if it becomes a collapsed state, perhaps they are. It wouldn't be the first time that allies have turned against one another when one of them has become weak. So on this, if we look through Europe, we look towards Europe and not just Poland, but to other areas, we certainly see that this conflict is leading to some political change and upheaval. In the Netherlands, the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte has resigned. His resignation has in part been due to, it appears, him unsettling the coalition there with requests around immigration, but there is also reports that the Dutch Farmers' Party, which have sprung up really out of the authoritarian lockdowns and controls that Rutte has enforced in the last a couple of years, what seems to be, I guess many would suggest, aligning with the World Economic Forum's goals of displacing farmers. Perhaps the rise of that Farmers' Party, he's seen the writing on the wall and believes that may be the way the tide is turning. Ben Wallace, the current UK Defence Secretary, he has reportedly announced that in the coming autumn, Northern Hemisphere autumn, cabinet reshuffle that the British PM Rishi Sunak will undertake, that he may look to leave politics at that stage. Now, Ben Wallace had his hand up for the Secretary General role of NATO, which Jens Stoltenberg should have been relinquishing, but no one was able to be selected, so Jens has got that role for another year. But Ben Wallace, while looking for it, was apparently denied the role by Joe Biden, and the reasoning given is that Wallace's eagerness to support Ukraine, and in particular his enthusiasm to get F-16s in the sky above Ukraine, appears to be what has turned Biden against him. The reasoning here is that Biden and the US recognize that if they were to put F-16s in the air over Ukraine, that they would suffer a fate similar to the Leopard 2s and find themselves smeared all over the front pages of Western nations as soon as they encountered the Russian S-400 air defense systems. So for that reason, and in much the same reason as the MI6 have reportedly told Ukraine to keep the Challenger tanks off the front line. So Challenger tanks have been supplied to Ukraine. We've not seen them in battle anywhere yet. And apparently it is for this reason. The learnings that the Germans went through with their Leopard tanks being destroyed in large numbers. The British and the US don't want to see this happening with their F-16s. And so that was the reason why Ben Wallace was denied Biden's support to get the NATO Secretary General role. So he may also be moving on. And then closer to home in Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, the former heavyweight boxing champion of the world, who had quite an amazing record, a 45 and 2 record, 45 wins, 2 losses. He has reportedly stated in an interview where he was asked about his desires to perhaps run for president of Ukraine. He suggested that whenever he's asked about this publicly, and if he comments on this, he finds that current President Volodymyr Zelensky, begins cleansing of political rivals and begins investigations, suggesting that he has been investigated by Zelensky's administration, and that Zelensky is currently cleansing out political rivals in the country. So, for a country which is attempting to get into NATO and attempting to establish democratic norms, this is not great press to have Vitaly Klitschko announcing that he himself has been the recipient or suffered under Zelensky's scrutiny in an attempt to perhaps remove him as being a political candidate. Now, having said that, using the term political norms, if we look to America, we see a very similar thing happening here with Donald Trump and Joe Biden, with Donald Trump being indicted on charges of mishandling classified documents, something which Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden himself have done in the past, yet Biden's administration has singled out Trump. And here, this is clearly an attempt to stop Trump from running in this election. If we look to just some of the recent rallies that Trump has had and public appearances, the support for him is very strong in America. Just this week, Trump attended a UFC match. He was led in by Dana White. During the commentary, there were a number of times. So Joe Rogan's there commentating. So Joe Rogan's obviously a very, very public, high-profile public figure. During the commentary, I think there was one time, it seemed, out of the time where they referenced former President Trump, that they used the word former. In all other cases, they just referred to him as President Trump, President Trump. There was a big, widely publicized on social media video clip of Donald Trump and Joe Rogan shaking hands and talking. There's a lot of public support for Trump at the moment. Biden is well aware of this. Biden is clearly beginning to suffer perhaps not the early, but the middle effects of dementia, and will struggle without doing something like jailing Trump to beat Trump in this election campaign. So, yeah, definitely some things starting to change politically around the world and being driven perhaps by this conflict in Ukraine. An interesting point on President Erdogan of Turkey. So he has been in the news recently for a number of reasons, for the Azov prisoner swap, well, not prisoner swap, but prisoner release, where he released Azov commanders back into Ukraine, breaking a deal held with Russia about the positioning or Turkey retaining those commanders in Turkey and not allowing them back into Ukraine to return to the battle. And now with Russia's decision to not extend the Baltic Sea grain deal, President Erdogan has commented in an interview yesterday that he has an August meeting scheduled with President Putin, and that he said we have common positions on the grain deal. Now, Dmitry Peskov, who's the press secretary to President Putin, has said that the timing of such a visit is unconfirmed at this stage. As I mentioned before, in war, there are things that go on behind the scenes, and I think that the Putin-Erdogan relationship is one of those. I don't think it's all as it seems on the surface. There have been claims that Turkey would protect Ukrainian ships travelling through the Black Sea against the Russian Black Sea fleet. I strongly doubt that Turkey would do something in a military sense to get itself engaged in this conflict. The repercussions for Turkey would be dramatic. It would be very easy for the Russians to enforce missile attacks upon the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles and cause large scale damage to those areas for Turkey, which Turkey doesn't want. I think this is more a higher, lighter level of disagreement between the two, and I'm sure that in the background there are understandings being made here, and that what Turkey is doing to some extent definitely is Erdogan being a savvy political player and taking the advantage for Turkey where he can. His recent agreement to allow Sweden to enter NATO appears to have been based upon some agreement of support from the US for EU entry for Turkey, and also for the supply of F-16s to Turkey. Although I do notice that the day after, at the summit that he had announced that Sweden could join, in an interview the day after, he suggested that actually there was a recess of the Turkish parliament for a few months, and October or November would be the very earliest that it would be possible for him to bring the ratification of Turkey allowing Sweden to join NATO to the parliament, and that the parliament would need to debate that and then agree upon it. So while at the NATO summit they were able to say that Sweden will be joining, at this stage that's something that wouldn't happen until at least October or November, and who knows by then what may change along the way. So yes, what's going on with the Black Sea grain deal? It is obviously going to have repercussions not only for Russia and Ukraine, but also for those nations who are dependent upon the grain that comes out of there. Yes, I think this is one just to keep an eye on. It'll be interesting to see what the outcome of a meeting with Erdogan and Putin might be in August, if that does go ahead. A little bit on the Wagner news, because the Wagner story does not die. So yes, it is confirmed now that the Wagner forces are doing their transition to Belarus. Videos been shown showing the Wagner forces and their troops and trucks moving into Belarus, transitioning to Belarusian control. There is the expectation that this will see them engaging in fighting again soon. Yevgeny Prigozhin has been public again and has reiterated that it's August the 5th is when Wagner expected to join the fight again. Given that they're moving up into Belarus, one would think that that would position them close to Kiev. Somewhere around that region, they might be looking to move down from the north and support there, or perhaps the Russians believe there is something to Polish or Lithuanian forces becoming involved in Ukraine or Belarus, and so they may be moving up there to perhaps deter the Polish and Lithuanians from thinking of coming into Belarus. Again, we'll see what happens there in August. Finally, just wanted to cover off a little bit on the Commander Popov story. So, Commander Popov was the commander of the 58th Army. He's Major General Ivan Popov. He has been a relatively young and fast-rising commander of the 58th Army. The 58th Army is a flagship army for the Russians. They single-handedly defeated Georgia, bested Georgia in 2008, and they have been leading the defense of the entire Zaporizhia region in this Ukraine conflict, and have repelled the biggest offensive by the Ukrainians so far. He released it was a private release in a chat to some of his subordinates, and in that he spoke of concerns about the Russian Ministry of Defense. This was then leaked, and this has seen him lose his position. Overall, I've got to admit, when seeing this story rise, I don't think it's of great consequence. Militaries are always revolving commanders, particularly in wartime. Not only if a commander is doing poorly, certainly then they'll be relieved of their command very rapidly. Even if they're doing well, often they will be moved to another area or another theatre to work somewhere else, and perhaps replace someone not doing as well as them there. In this case, it appears as though he's lost his current commandship. But again, not of particular consequence in terms of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Russia has already put a replacement in for him, who was a former deputy of the 58th. So I don't think there'll be a great upheaval or upset to Russia because of this. But I think for the Ukrainian side, definitely some PR value in being able to claim that this commander was making complaints, criticising the Ministry of Defence. Now, that's happened a number of times, in most high-profile circumstances, being with Yevgeny Prigozhin, criticising Defence Minister Sergei Shoigu, and the Chief of the General Staff for the Russian Armed Forces, Valery Gerasimov. Gerasimov actually was also a previous commander of the 58th Army. And while there has been some criticism of their work, interestingly, the Ukrainian commander of their armed forces, Zaluzhny has actually stated that he believes that Gerasimov is the best commander of his generation in Russia, and that Zaluzhny has read and studied all of Gerasimov's books. So, I think take this with a grain of salt within any battle, particularly for a relatively young commander in such a stressful situation as he will have been in. It's not uncommon for there to be complaints about his superiors, and in a war which has evolved over the last 15 months or so, certainly there will have been hiccups and things along the way, which you would imagine would improve on both sides. Supply chains, logistics will improve as issues are detected. All right. That's it for today. I hope you're having a good one. If you've liked this, please subscribe to the channel, give it a like, tell your friends. I look forward to talking to you soon.